Michelle heard these voices. And as her book, The New Jim Crow, swept the world, her work has created the space for our stories to be heard and our solutions to be taken seriously. I remember, so this is a very exciting moment for me because Michelle, of course, has really transformed the space, and conversation has had a great impact on the work that we all do. But she has also had, as I kind of explained a little earlier to you personally, has had a really huge impact on my life and my career, and she didn't even know it. I met Michelle for the first time in the flesh today. But I feel like I've been having conversations with her in my bedroom forever, in front of my computer, like, you know what, Michelle, you know what we need to do. Like, sis, walk this way, let me have a talk with you. That's been me and Michelle for way longer than she knows, or maybe I should admit. But I remember hearing, so I was an attorney, as you heard, in Harlem, and I remember going down to NYU where she was speaking, and hearing her speak about what we needed to do, how we need to throw ourselves into this fight, how this needed to be a movement. And it was a call to action for me personally. Less than a year later, I left that law office. I transitioned my practice and I came here, and Essie is a direct result of that call to action. Direct result. One of my favorite quotes is it goes, "The job of every writer is to make revolution irresistible." And we have here today a writer that has made revolution irresistible for so many of us in this room. And that is why it is such a pleasure and such an honor to invite you to come up here and have a real conversation, a real intimate talk, our fireside chat. Ladies and gentlemen, Michelle is here. Welcome. Okay, let's get right into it. I got my questions. Okay, they're right here.
Let me just say first, before you get started, is, I actually feel a little emotional right now. You are a dream come true. You are a dream come true for the people who are in this room. And, at a time when I first started working on my book, there were a lot of people who said, "You're crazy." What are you doing writing a book like that? You're not getting tenure writing a book like that. There are a lot of naysayers in my life, including people who I thought were mentors and supporters who weren't there. And I remember just feeling this overwhelming sense that, there were so many people who already knew what I was about to say was true, and had been doing this work for a long time, much longer than I had been. But I wanted to create something that would help empower sort of other people to carry the work forward to places in spaces that I could not. And I remember writing a line in my book which focused on the experience of Black men in the criminal justice system. And I said, it is my hope, and it was my prayer, that other people would, other advocates and scholars would pick up where this leaves off and apply it more broadly, take it beyond where I had been able to go. And you are the answer to that hope and that prayer. And so many of the people in this room are the answer to that hope and prayer. And many of you have been doing this work in beautiful ways long before I got in the game. And I just want to say thank you, in a really personal way, for your passion, your commitment, your brilliance, but also just for answering that call. Because many of us hear the call and we think we've got something else to do. And you answered the call. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, this is so fun. Like a dream come true. So let's dive right in, because we're gonna get into it a little bit. But first, I just want us to all get on one page, because we have a lot of people in this room. I mean, pretty much most people in this room have been working in this space in some way, shape, or form. And we all hear this word mass incarceration, and we say the words mass incarceration so often. But it would maybe be helpful just for you to define it for us, for you to tell us, what is mass incarceration as you see it?
Well, when I wrote the book, I defined mass incarceration as not only all those people who are literally behind bars in prisons and jails, held in cages, but also all those who are cycling in and out of prisons and jails, people who are on probation and parole. And also, I conceived of mass incarceration as including all those who were trapped in permanent second-class status, people who had been stripped of the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, who were, lawfully discriminated against in employment, housing, access to education, basic public benefits, the whole laundry list of forms of discrimination that were keeping people trapped in invisible cages and locked in, inferior status for life. In the years since I've written the book and I've talked to a lot of folks, and I continue to evolve in my own thinking, I've come to believe that the term mass incarceration itself, just as a term, is too limited. And I am persuaded that talking in terms of mass criminalization is a more effective way of conveying what we're trying to get at. That it's not just simply who's behind bars or who's incarcerated in a literal way, but this process of criminalizing people and communities and families that we really need to dismantle. And it's not just the institution of prison itself.
Yeah. So I think this is really interesting about the terminology, because I think that we have been sometimes wondering, even within our organizations, like, can we say abolition? Can we say mass criminalization? Have we just gotten kind of the mainstream to get that mass incarceration is a thing? Is introducing this new word or verb, kind of phraseology going to be counteractive or difficult for us in a practical way? Can you maybe talk a little bit about whether or not you feel like there is any value in talking about mass incarceration, or do we talk about abolition, or are there certain words that we should be using when we're doing this work?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the question of language is always a difficult one, and I believe now, more than I ever have before, that we ought to use language that makes sense to people, that they get immediately, that is, to the extent that we can avoid having to translate our terminology for the people particularly who are most affected, the better, and so, I think that as somebody who's spent a lot of time in academia, and certainly as someone who's trained as a lawyer, I know that it can become very habit forming to use language that nobody else really understands, and I don't feel like we do, any favors to the movement, but I also don't think that we are acknowledging the power and the ability of the language that people use in their own daily lives to describe their experience, if we cling to terms that don't feel real. But at the same time, I think that saying mass criminalization, I think people get what that means. Yeah. I don't think you need to translate that for people. I think people understand that. And when it comes to abolition, I personally consider myself, a prison abolitionist. I consider myself, but I think that when I use that term publicly, I always have to explain what I mean. Because I think, especially when you're talking to folks who, have experienced violence, who fear violence in their lives, they say prison abolition. Well, my God, well then what? That's just the obvious next question. You know, what about the folks who are, you know, shooting up on the street? What about the woman who's been violated or abused or raped? What about? And so for me, I believe that we should end prisons as we know them, as sites of dehumanization, of degradation, that yes, it may be necessary at times to remove people from the community. You know, at least until we're at a place where we've evolved, right. You know, where violence isn't a part of people's daily lives in communities. We may need to remove people, but we absolutely do not have to have prisons as we know them, where people are locked in literal cages, treated as less than human, and where punitiveness you know, is the point. And so, you know, I think that if we explain what we mean by the words that we use, you know, we can always tell the truth.
That's beautiful. You know, words are really important in this work, and I think that there's something about the words and the understandings that we collect from community, and it teaches us, I think, how we ought to be saying things and how we ought to be translating things. And I imagine that since you wrote your book and you've been on what probably was the longest book tour ever, that you met a lot of people, and that a lot of people, I mean, I'm sure all the time people must be coming up to you to tell you their stories, you know, how you impacted them, and you're probably hearing a lot more than everyone else, really. I mean, just as kind of a listener, I would be interested to know kind of what are you hearing in these spaces and places that you go. Take us on tour with us a little bit, if you possibly could.
Well, you know, I think that in many ways, some of what was just read, you know, in the letters that were shared is what I heard on the road, you know, every day from people who, you know, I did speak in, you know, a number of prisons and juvenile detention centers, but mostly I was speaking audiences. You know, people who are not currently incarcerated, and yet in every place and space, people had loved ones behind bars, and over and over again, you hear the stories of the pain and the trauma and the sadness and just outrageous stories of injustice. You hear about heroic efforts of people to try to free their loved ones and to build campaigns. And you also hear lots of stories of, you know, tragic endings. And so, you know, I think that for me, part of what has stood out and what I've shared with you is that over the years, it's difficult for me to think of a time where I've gone to a gathering and where lots of people have turned out, and then afterwards they say, all right, we're going to have a meeting, you know, this is very happening, we're going to have a meeting for people who want to now take action to do something about what we just heard, and everyone applauds, and the meeting is going to begin right after the big event. And I'd say almost every time, well, not only does the crowd shrink, but, you know, 70, 80% of the people who turn out to do something are women. Women who have, you know, incarcerated loved ones. That those are the people who tend to turn out to actually get some work done and to engage in, you know, the nitty-gritty hard work of advocacy. And I don't think that's unusual, you know, to the United States or even to this cause. I mean, as research has shown around the world, foundations have discovered that if you want to make change in a community, you go to the women who live in the community and talk to them about what needs to be done. And that certainly has been, you know, the case as I've seen in my travels, that it's often the women.
So then I have a question, because if that's the case, and I think, you know, is Hedwig Lee somewhere, or is Yeah, Dr. Hedwig Lee is here, and this is another incredible woman who is the lead author of what we call at Essie the 1 in 4 report. And this was a really important report that said that really revealed that 1 in 4 women in the United States has a family member in prison. And this was kind of the first time that we've heard a number or even a description. There have been some qualitative, but very little research attention, or even media attention or conversations. When I started, I'll tell you, I Googled women with incarcerated loved ones. I have a notification on my email that things will come to me if the phrase women with incarcerated loved one pops up in any media. I get an email about it. It almost never happens. And when it does, someone was talking to someone in one of these Essie sisters. I know it. I'm like, oh, I know that person. That's the only time. And so I guess, why do you think that is? Why do you think that the conversation that is now a national dialogue has not included the stories and this huge population that is in the millions? For Black women, nearly 1 in 2 of us has a family member in prison, and that's not even counting jails. So how is it possible that this isn't getting coverage? Can you unpack that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of reasons.
Yeah.
I think that, first of all, to the extent there has been any attention on kind of the plight of people who are impacted by incarceration, and there hasn't been much attention paid just until very recently at all. But to the extent that there's been attention paid, it's, I think, been viewed by many as just sort of common sense to pay attention to the people who are incarcerated. And most of the people, overwhelmingly, 90+% of people who are incarcerated are men. And so let's talk about men. And since disproportionately the men who are incarcerated are Black, let's talk about Black men. And so there's been sort of a common sense attitude about, well, who is most affected? Well, let's look at who's actually in prison. And again, the language is important, because if you're talking about who's incarcerated, then you're going to look into prison and you're going to focus on who's in prison, and you're not going to focus on who is necessarily impacted in a broader sense by incarceration. But I think it's more than that. I think it's more than just the demographics of who's locked in cages. I think it's also that we blame. We have blame and shame attached to incarceration in a way that has ripple effects on the people, their families, and the communities around them. And because we tend to blame those who are behind bars, if you didn't want to do the time, then why did you do the crime? We also tend to have much less interest in and sympathy or empathy for those who have been affected by their incarceration. We imagine that if those people are suffering, if the mother of the incarcerated young man is suffering, if the aunt of a young girl who's held in juvie is suffering, if a woman is struggling because she's now having to support her boyfriend or her partner who has returned home from prison, well, it is the incarcerated person's fault. We should blame them. And what is she doing anyway, supporting this man who's no good coming back to their home? So now she's blamed because she actually is loving and caring for someone who we label as bad or wrong, a no good felon, criminal, etc. And so I think it makes it very easy for us to become, indifferent and blind. I'm very grateful for the work of Donald Bramman, who wrote the book Doing Time on the Outside, which I think helped to, at least, within some circles, begin the process of educating people that actually those on the outside are doing time in their own way with those who are behind bars. And so, I think part of the process of getting people to care more about women who have incarcerated loved ones is reckoning with the problem of shame. Shame and blame, the way we tend to blame those who are involved in the criminal justice system and who are impacted for their plight.
Do you think that, the shaming and the blaming that we do is is part of, as a society, I mean, is part of almost like a convenient detachment of responsibility. I mean,
Absolutely.
And so to what extent is that also part of bringing more people in? And how do we all own this problem, I think, is the question that I have. How do you explain that this is not just communities of color that should care about this, or women with incarceration, but it should be all of the people in this country need to care about this? How do you explain that to folks and draw people in as workers for the future that we want to create?
I think it's a great question. I mean, for me personally, I think one of the things that we really need to, I used to say one of the things we need to do is start owning our own criminality publicly. We're all criminals, like the criminals aren't them, it's us. That this idea that, the criminals are other people who have done wrong, or that someone was a criminal and now isn't a criminal. We're all constantly doing wrong. We're all constantly making mistakes. I mean, sort of in the Christian tradition, it's framed around sin. We're all sinners. In different faith traditions, there's other language and ways of talking about it. But I think, helping people to not imagine that the wrongdoers are other people, but to see the way in which we're all struggling. We're all messing up. And we all make mistakes, large and small. And this practice of imagining that the criminals are other people, not us, and that those who love those who have done wrong ought to be blamed or shamed, I think is a dynamic that, is a reflection of how much denial we're in about the fact that, many of us have done far worse than the people that we, shame and blame routinely, or that if we had been in their shoes, it's hard to argue that we would have made better choices or somehow been better people. And so, I think, certainly when you're talking to privileged audiences, reminding those folks that, what, you didn't do drugs when you were in high school or in college? You didn't, drink underage? You didn't engage in shoplifting? You didn't you didn't do any of those things? You didn't make any of those mistakes? I think is helpful in encouraging some empathy and compassion for those who have made mistakes, large and small, under a whole range of circumstances, and yet find themselves shamed and blamed perpetually. But I also think that beyond just sort of the interpersonal kind of dynamics and how we view ourselves and one another, there are real structural forces at play that we have to pay attention to. I remember one of the cases that I had when I was a law clerk in D.C. shortly upon graduating from law school involved a grandmother who was being charged with possession of a significant amount of drugs. They weren't hers, they were her grandson's that had been found in the house, but they were charging her with possession because they wanted her to snitch on her grandson and get her grandson to, plea out to a bunch of conspiracy-related charges. And so they were charging her with possession to try to get her to snitch, and she wouldn't. And she absolutely refused, and who knows whether she had any valuable information or not, but she absolutely refused. And so then when they couldn't get her to, testify against her own grandson, they then brought forfeiture proceedings against her so that she would lose their home. Believing that, if she was at risk of losing their home and the only thing she had was her home, she would be homeless, she would be out on her street, she lived on Social Security, she had no income, and still she refused to testify against her grandson. And, I think people don't often know, the general public doesn't actually know how frequently, people who have loved ones behind bars are not only placed under extraordinary pressure to provide economic support, emotional support for loved ones behind bars, but often how they become the target themselves of law enforcement investigation and activity in ways that I think would shock the conscience of people even who are quick to shame and blame.
So I think that one of the things that has been really beneficial to all of the movement, is that formerly incarcerated people have really led.
Yes.
And they've led the work, they've led the solution building, they've led the thinking, they've led communities. With or without recognition, they've been leaders of this work. And I wonder, what do you see as kind of, and I think, we talk about, I think most in this room would agree, that directly impacted leadership is what we need to deliver us kind of through the crisis moments. But we kind of throw around this term directly impacted. And I'm wondering, in your mind, does directly impacted people, does that expand to the family? Does that expand to people who maybe never were incarcerated themselves, but maybe include women with incarcerated loved ones or children with incarcerated parents? How wide does that definition, that term, go for you?
Wow, I mean, I think it includes anyone who feels impacted, right? I spoke at an event in Richmond a couple of years ago. It was held in a big, huge theater, and the organizers of the event bussed high school students to the event, and a bunch of those area high schools were reading the book and having discussion groups, and so they bussed everybody in for the event. And the man who opened, the event began by saying, how many people here currently has, a parent behind bars, and, a striking number of, the young people stood up. And he began to say, well, then how many people have, a relative behind bars? And, a huge number of the crowd stood up. And, how many people, have a friend who, is behind bars. And as more and more people began to stand, they began stomping. It was like there was so much emotion as people were acknowledging all of the loved ones, all of the friends, all of the family members who were behind bars, just stomping and stomping and stomping. And then he said, is there anyone in this room? Everyone sat down when it was over, and then he said, is there anyone in this room who has not been affected by the crisis of mass incarceration? If there's anyone here, please rise. Nobody, stood up. And you're in a community where literally there isn't anybody who hasn't been impacted by mass incarceration. And it was, low income community of color. Now, of course, there are communities in the United States where, a good 80% of the room would stand when they said, you're not being impacted directly by incarceration. But, thanks to, the hungry beast that is our prison system, it's no longer the case that you can find many communities where a significant percentage of the population isn't directly impacted. And that's what the 1 in 4 statistic is all about. That, in fact, in nearly every community, you have people who are directly impacted, and women, have, an extraordinary percentage of women have loved ones behind bars.
Yeah. So this problem seems so entrenched and so vast. I mean, you just got finished saying it's everybody, pretty much, in so many ways. But yet, you are one of the hopeful ones. You write about how you're optimistic, how you believe that change is possible. And I think that those of us who are doing the work must believe that we can change it to do it. And I guess I'd like to know where your hope stems from. Why do you think that it's possible to dismantle and rebuild?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, it's not because the Koch brothers are getting together with, democratic leadership. That's not where the hope lies. No, for me, the hope lies in this, right? The hope lies in the fact that you do see all across the country people waking up and finding their voice. And, to me, the fact that the most hopeful development for me, honestly, was the formerly incarcerated and convicted people's movement really finding their voice and beginning to organize in a serious way. To me, it's when the people who are kind of the most despised, the people who are the most marginalized and imagined to have no power suddenly say, I matter, I have a voice, my life matters, my voice matters, and I'm willing to act. That to me is the revolutionary moment. And so what gives me hope is that you see growing numbers of people who aren't supposed to believe in themselves, who are supposed to remain quiet, no longer cooperating with that plan. And that's what gives me hope. And I think, I love Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, but I think the one thing that worries me, or worried me when I read it, is that I think he conveys a sense of powerlessness and inevitability. And to me, that's the greatest lie we're taught, that we're powerless. And as long as we believe that lie, that we actually don't have power, there's not really much of anything that we can do, we might as well just try to get ahead, go along to get along, scrape by as we can. As long as we believe that that really is the full range of our potential, and that we're checkmated, then I think this system continues to hum along fine indefinitely. But the minute we refuse to cooperate with that and imagine we have power and that our voice matters, and that our life matters, and that we're willing to take action on behalf of ourselves and our loved ones, that to me is the moment where there's real reason to hope and to imagine that building the kind of movement that has the potential for shaking the foundations of the system isn't just a pipe dream, that we can do it.
Wow, we can do it. I do believe that. I think, and one of the things that I'm really committed to is movement building, and I think with movements come different types of populations and different perspectives, and we are here to talk about women and about the power of women. And women with incarcerated loved ones are incarcerated women. They're formerly incarcerated women. They're women who have loved ones on the inside that look like trans people, that look like women, that look men, that look like all people. And so I think one of the things that we struggle with is kind of these narrow definitions. Someone immediately, at first when I started this work, I would talk about it, and people would tell me, "Oh, Gina, that is great. You're focusing on women who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women. We need so much more resources and attention. This is an important, powerful group." And I say, yes, absolutely, that's right. But what I said was women with incarcerated loved ones, and so yes, all of that's true. But step back, and there's more. There's bigger. There's also women with, and we didn't have a frame for that. There wasn't anyone talking about this group, and I wonder whether beyond what you said, because you said women do it all and they do it well. And that's what I heard. I don't know. That's what I wanted to hear. But I think we're on the same page about that. And I guess beyond us as useful creatures, right? Like we can be organized and we can make sure people show up and we can do all that. Is there something uniquely valuable about our perspective in this fight and struggle?
Well, I would like to hear what you have to say about that, honestly, because I think that there is. I mean, I think that women for throughout human history, it seems, have provided the connective tissue for communities. And they have been a source of kind of intelligent nurturing and support for communities, families, throughout human history. Their role is often minimized or denied or ignored, but women have a perspective on what it means to love and to care for families and partners and to build community that is unique and is distinct. And there's a reason why when people are released from prison, they typically go home to a place that has a female head of household, right? They typically go home to their mom, to their aunt, to their grandmother, that they go home to a place where it's their girlfriend or their partner. They go home to a place that has been held together for them by a woman. And that is often the role that women play, is as a place of, holding space, holding community, holding together homes for people. And, I focused in my writing, recently to some extent on how, to the extent the war on drugs has really begun to target women to some degree, it's really threatens the complete unraveling, sort of the genocidal unraveling of Black communities, because you're stripping away the very fragile bonds that continue to exist in so many of these communities. But I believe that women have a unique perspective, have had a unique role throughout our history in holding and leading movements, often without the recognition that they deserve. And, I want to hear what you have to say about that as well, because I think that, it would not have occurred to me to create an organization like this. And yet now it seems like common sense, of course. Of course we need an organization that provides support to women who have loved ones behind bars. And of course we need an organization that will support women as they become emerging leaders in this movement. Of course, as a matter of common sense. But until you did it, it hadn't been done. So I would love to hear your perspective on it.
Well, okay. I have questions. I don't have answers. I think at Essie we are working. We don't walk in assuming that we know the answers, but we go to community and have these spaces where we're exploring these questions. And one of the questions that many of the women in this room who were up here earlier had the chance to explore together was, what's the connection between, you draw so beautifully you connect the dots, right, between racism and the racial caste system and Jim Crow and this system of control that is mass incarceration. And we were thinking, well, what about patriarchy? In what way has this form of control over women played into this system? And how is that a motor behind what we see happening? And is it just, and I think this is kind of the kind of interesting connect, if you can follow me. So if patriarchy is maybe a root cause of mass incarceration, and not merely that mass incarceration is effectuating gender inequality, which that's an easier argument to make, right? 1 in 4 women have incarcerated loved ones. They are sacrificing money, time, attention, mental health, all of these things, so they are not accessing their full potential in society. That's clear. Mass incarceration is a women's rights issue just in that form. But if we can go deeper to root causes, which I think is what I love about how you approach the work. You want to not just tinker, as I say, as you've been saying, you want to overhaul, and that requires us to dig deeper. We've been asking ourselves, is it enough to talk about racism? Must we also talk about gender? And I think our perspective is that yes. I mean, stand with her, decarcerating for gender justice. It's all about trying to fit that into and having more than one, being able to open ourselves up to have all of those kind of conversations at once. If that makes sense.
I think it's such an important set of questions to be exploring, because obviously it's not just about race It's also about capitalism. It's about dealing with, surplus labor as, capital moves overseas, but people cannot, right? Capital can flow freely, so companies can shut down and move overseas, and entire communities are jobless. And what do you do with people who are jobless and desperate? And if you're not willing to invest in those communities, if those lives don't seem to matter, well, you can lock them up. And so asking the question, well, yeah, so it's about race, it's about capitalism, it's got to be about gender as well. And I think if you look at the tools of mass incarceration, right, they're the tools of domination. It's about power and control, and it's domination. And if you look about how, basically men have engaged in the oppression of women as well as of other races, we're talking about tools of, domination and of control. And, so I think that thinking about, the relationship between patriarchy, how, our gendered ideas of, what justice means and looks like, is critically important. And so, I'll be looking for your book on the origins of...
Long time from now. I have a full to-do list. Well, I need to do a time check because I'm just lost in this conversation. I need to, can someone help me make sure? I want to make sure there's enough time for community. I'm okay? I don't know what time we're ending or what. Oh, great. Okay. Sorry. Can you tell I've never done this before?
You are.
Okay, well, so I kind of want to stick on this patriarchy women thing. It's a little bit of a challenge, I think, for us to talk about that, and it's new, and so it's what's interesting to me. So I'm just going to indulge in that a little bit. Can you talk about whether or not, are you a feminist?
Yeah.
Can I ask that?
Yes, you can. Actually, we had a conversation about this once before, and I think this kind of goes back to language and how we use language and in what ways. And I think when people say, "Are you a feminist?" I always have to say, "Well, what do you mean by that?" I think that the term now carries connotations, meanings that I don't always feel comfortable with. If you say, well, do I believe in equality of women? Do I believe in, the importance and value of women's voices and their dignity and the necessity of women being able to determine their own experience and destinies? Well, of course. Yes, yes. But I feel that because the feminist movement has been dominated and shaped so much by white women, and particularly privileged white women, that there's ways in which the feminist label doesn't feel comfortable entirely to me. And that doesn't mean that I can say I'm not a feminist, but it means that, if you say, are you a feminist? It's like, are you claiming an identity? You're claiming an identity. And so I the term womanist sometimes feels better, but, I feel more comfortable describing what I believe than claiming an identity that for me has been shaped in a way that isn't one that completely feels like my own. And, I also, I think I've mentioned to you that there's certain words that, I think that for me, I stay away from unless I'm going to spend a lot of time kind of processing with others what they mean. And so feminism is one, racism is one. In my book, I use the word racism like probably less than 5 times. I actually didn't spend a lot of time saying, this is racist, I said.
Isn't that interesting though? Because if that's That's incredible, because that's, to me, what I was reading, right? I felt like that was what you were communicating without saying that. I mean, that's very artful. Were you making decisions? Did you have to try and edit out, like, oh, I accidentally said racism, and then delete?
You know, I consciously decided I was only going to use the word racism if I explained what I meant by the word. That because I think racism it has a lot of different meanings to different people. I think it's most commonly associated with intentional bigotry. That's not what I was talking about. Sure, there was intentional bigotry that was part of the many forces that gave rise to mass incarceration. But to label the whole system of mass incarceration simply as racist without spending a lot of time explaining exactly what is meant by that, you know, so for me, I'm someone, and I may be wrong in this, but for me, I personally don't enjoy spending a lot of time arguing about what words mean. So, you know, it's like, if you want to say racism and intentional bigotry, well, fine. What I'm going to say is that we have a system of racial and social control that is destroying millions of lives. And if you call it what you want, but it is destroying millions of lives, and do you care? Do you care? Are you willing to do something about it? And so, you know, for me, I think sometimes the argument about terminology starts to feel more like an academic argument, and what does racism really means, and can a black person be racist? Can they or can't they? Okay, look, people are dying. Yeah. People are hurting. There are systems and forces at work that are treating people as though they're less than human because of the color of the skin, because of the neighborhoods they live in. Do you care? We can talk about what you want to call it, whether this word's the best or that, but do you care? What are you willing to do? And so when I speak publicly, I try to avoid words that are going to get into long, protracted debates about what the words mean, and try to focus on what is the lived experience, what is actually happening, and what are we willing to do about it. And so for me, feminism gets me into a long conversation about what the word means. Racism gets me into a long conversation about the word means. And so I tend to avoid that. But I think a good case can be made that we need to spend time developing words and language that resonate and convey, you know, with clarity exactly what we're trying to communicate.
Yeah. I love how purposeful you are. I mean, I think that we sometimes get lost in just the complexity, and, you know, to just be able to plainly say what the vision is and what we want to see and where we're going and how to get, I mean, that's really, it can be hard. And I think that one of the things that can be hard is also naming the pain, because it can feel really amorphous and really abstract. And I think that for me, there has been usefulness in calling something racism and saying, why? Because at some point, our ancestors in the work helped to make it a bad thing to be a racist. Like, that was that's a bad thing. I think that most would agree that in the United States, you call someone a racist, everyone knows that you're saying something bad about that person, right? And that's useful as people who are trying to create social change and transform opinions. That's been useful. Yeah. And so what do we do when there's a set of experiences for which we maybe don't have that word, where there's bad things like happening to women, you know, and I think patriarchy is the word that I'm thinking about. And that's a word that's been hard and complicated for us as an organization, and for a lot of people in this room who do gender justice work. It's like, we're not allowed to say patriarchy because everyone's gonna get up and leave and think that we're, you know, a whole lot of things that we aren't. And so I'm wondering whether or not, as an advisory council member, you know, you would say, you know, Essie Justice Group, I would advise you not to use the word patriarchy because it makes people leave and people don't really understand what it means. Or would you say, I would invest the time in defining that word and creating that new definition because naming is important? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of
it makes sense. But, you know, I think honestly, I feel like it's an important conversation to have. And you know, without even participating in that debate, I don't want to say where I would ultimately come out on it. I think I would really want to hear what people would say. For me, if you get on the news and you're talking to a mass audience and you say patriarchy, people go, what? What? So I think, to me, I think ordinary language has the capacity to explain our experience. And that doesn't mean that we can't use, define, make up any kind of word we want. But I think that when you got to ask yourself, okay, why do I want to use this word, and in what situations, and is it my mission to educate the world about what the word patriarchy means, or is the language we have capable of describing our experience? And I'm not going to advise one way or the other, because I think it's a really important question to have. And I don't think there, aside from sexism, right, there isn't actually a word that exists that describes well the experience of gender oppression, besides patriarchy. And so maybe a good case can be made that actually this is a word that we want to use and to popularize and to help people understand its meaning, and that it can do important work for us. But I do think it's an important question. I personally tend to avoid using language that I don't think ordinary folks who haven't been to grad school and haven't spent a lot of time kind of debating this stuff aren't going to immediately understand, or it's not going to resonate with.
Yeah.
But I would open to being persuaded the other way.
Awesome. So let me see where I am with. I actually want to spend a little time going back to your hopefulness, because I think we could all, we're all kind of on these paths. Many of us here have strategies for 2016. We have our operational plans. We know what we're going to do, and I would love for you to kind of inform. Just, your book came out, and then a lot happened, right? We have a lot happened. All the Black Lives Matter happened. Policing and became an issue, and it really under scrutiny in an important way. I would love to hear about what you think, how that connects to your work and your analysis. How does abusive policing and all of what's happening with Black Lives Matter both fit into mass incarceration?
Yes.
And what's the relationship? And how is that a movement that has anything to do with ending the movement to end mass incarceration or mass criminalization?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the movement to end, the movement for the Black Lives Matter movement is just such a beautiful, extraordinary development. And I do. And, I think even just the phrase Black Lives Matter has just so, it is already, I was going to say it has such great potential. It is already, I think, made it possible for many, many people to be able to do that work that I consider revolutionary, of saying, my life matters, my voice matters. So, I think it's phenomenal. I've been, I have to say, a little disappointed that, at least publicly, those who have spoken to mainstream news outlets and all of that haven't always connected the dots between, police brutality, police killings, and this larger system of control. And so there have been times when I've been disappointed or sort of anxious, like, aren't you going to connect those dots, for me, just as in lynching wasn't the only thing wrong in, during the old Jim Crow era, but just the ugliest, most brutal expression of that system of control. I think these police killings aren't the only thing wrong, right? It's just the ugliest, most brutal, most heinous expression of this much larger, and reflection of this much larger system of control. And I think that is a point that I hope gets made, by those who are, really kind of leading and framing the way the Black Lives Matter movement is understood in the public consciousness. Because to me, these police killings provide the perfect entree into that conversation. But we have to open the door wide for people to be able to come into the larger conversation and be able to see, oh, it's not just about police shooting some unarmed black man, woman, etc. This is about a much larger system of control that is destroying the lives of millions of people who are currently incarcerated, as well as millions of people who are cycling in and out, and millions of people who love those who are having this experience and are supporting them in various ways as well. And so I think that those dots can be connected fairly easily, and I hope that we see more of it.
So, okay, I'm going to do the opposite of the hope thing, I think, for a second. So bear with me. What happens if nothing changes? What happens if if we all just stop right now and you know, we're like, oh, we're good. What happens then? Are we, like, can you kind of describe you know, in the sense of, because to me, there seems to be a future in the negative direction as well, and that we have to take seriously and reckon with. And I wonder how you would describe what it looks like if, and it won't happen because of all of the people in this room, but what if? Can you help us understand that?
Well, I mean, everything always changes. It's always in motion. The system is constantly evolving and adapting, and so there's no way that what exists right now will remain forever. It'll continue to change forms. It'll continue to evolve as economic circumstances change, as political circumstances change. So things will continue to change, even if, for example, our movement stagnates, right? And, you know, I think, for me, I think my greatest worry in terms of the changes are in the direction of kind of technology and increasing surveillance. And, you know, so for me, what my greatest fear isn't so much that the movement stalls completely, but that it begins to accept or define as progressive or as progress reforms that are actually enabling the mutation of the system rather than really ending it. And so for me, kind of this you know, many advocates embracing you know, the GPS tracking devices and you know, home surveillance, installing video surveillance in your home if you're under house arrest, all the forms of surveillance that I think, you know, many people quite rightly embrace as an improvement over being kept in a literal cage 24/7. Yeah, would you rather be in an apartment or wearing a GPS device than being locked in? Of course, who would not make that choice? But I think embracing enthusiastically technological surveillance and control over kind of brick and mortar forms of control is actually enabling the system in ways that, you know, actually are quite worrisome to me. And so, you know, I think that we have to be careful ourselves that, you know, as we work hard to improve the day-to-day lived experience of those we love who are returning home from prison, that we also don't campaign for, work for reforms that are actually going to help to sustain the system and broaden and expand kind of the level of control you know, it has in our lives. I even see police cameras that way, to be honest with you. You know, I think it's ironic that, you know, we're arguing for the police to be able to perpetually film us in every single encounter. You know, I mean, there was a time when people, the ACLU used to be worried about the cameras on telephone poles, you know, having constant surveillance of neighborhoods and street corners and where every movement was watched. And now we're like, advocacy. Can you please wear a camera and film us all the time, every time you see us or interact with us? And all of that footage will be available as evidence, in court. It's worrisome to me. And so I think part of our challenge is adapting to, changing environments and trying to prevent being co-opted by what's offered as reform.
Co-opted, exactly. I mean, that's a perfect example of what I really want to kind of stay there for a second, because with the policing and the body cameras and all of that, there have been people who have been working, advocates who've been working in that space and issue and been leaders and have already developed solutions and answers and had strategies. And they did not include the body cameras. I mean, that was not what it was. And no one, when we had all of a sudden raised the noise level and kind of the alarm bells on this issue, no one kind of went to them, or at least their solutions, and it wasn't uplifted in the mainstream. Yeah. And so and I know many of those advocates, and I think, and they're strong and they're powerful and they're eloquent and all these things. So how do we keep, I think this space has become a bit noisy. Maybe that's also a little bit your fault. In the sense that you've invited us all to talk about it, and that's good, good. But it also means that we have a lot of voices that maybe we ought not be listening to. And I wonder whether or not, is there a way that we can kind of navigate through the noise? Like, how do we do that? And is it a media strategy? Is it like making sure that we're not using words that are, like, what is it that will ensure that our work is not co-opted?
Well, I think one of the challenges in movement building, and I think we're seeing this play out in a lot of ways right now, even in the Black Lives Matter movement, is learning how to disagree with one another constructively, so that you're not blowing up relationships, even if you're disagreeing on strategy, even if you're critiquing, particular reform proposals or whatever. And I have seen a lot of hesitancy within the community to say, we disagree with the body cameras, or we disagree with the GPS, or this or that, but we can't say that. We can't say it because it'll upset this funder, or it'll upset our ally, or it'll upset. And I think there's also a lot of defensiveness. Nobody wants to have their own policy agenda or strategies criticized, and so if they are, then they become angry. And I think I even said this around the whole kind of crazy blow up that occurred between Michael Eric Dyson and Cornel West. In a way that these things are like personality conflicts and little dramas that are playing out, but actually these things are extraordinarily damaging for movements, right? When you cannot figure out a way to disagree constructively and productively, and recognize that we can critique each other, we can disagree with each other, but still acknowledge that we're all trying to kind of get to the same goal, broadly defined. And you look at the history of the civil rights movement, you look at the history of movements around the world that end up blowing up or fizzling or dividing because people cannot figure out how to manage their disagreements. And so I would hope that part of what we develop as a culture in our movement building practice is ways of being able to disagree constructively with one another, and disagree even with foundations, and disagree in a way that doesn't blow up relationships and turn into kind of a feuding or feeling of betrayal and all of the rest. And I certainly have experienced some tension around this in my own life, because coming out of the civil rights movement, civil rights community, working at the ACLU and finding myself wanting to critique some of what the ACLU, my former employer, had done, what my friends are doing. I have friends who are working on Hillary's campaign right now. I don't support Hillary Clinton. We have differing, ways of moving and being in this work.
Who are you supporting?
Actually, I'm not publicly endorsing anybody.
You don't have to answer that.
Yeah, no.
It could be a no comment.
No. I mean, I think I don't want to say that I'm supporting any one candidate. I have big concerns about the Democratic Party, period. And so, for me, I can easily say I'm not supporting Hillary. And, I think it was kind of a question mark for me for a long while whether I would even vote in the Democratic Party primary. And I consider myself an independent. But I think the Democratic Party doesn't hold a lot of hope for our collective future. So I'm hoping that part of this movement building process is the emergence of new political formations that come into being. So, yeah.
Speaking of the political, and this is also one of these, I didn't say that I was going to ask you this, so totally fair if it's not okay. But our current president has brought some of this into the conversation. Not all, I would say, but some. And I wonder what your observations are of his leadership in key criminal justice moments.
I don't know, I'll tell you what, I generally resist critiquing Obama or anyone as sort of an individual. I think that to me it's more important to critique the systems and the attitudes and the public consensus that supports our politicians. It's very easy for me to say, President Obama was late to the party. He hasn't said, if Newt Gingrich is speaking out about criminal justice reform before you are, you're late to the party. It's not that Obama wasn't speaking about criminal justice reform. He did even when he was on the campaign trail, but he wasn't advocating a criminal justice reform agenda until there was already some bipartisan movement on it. So he hasn't been a leader in the effort, but he also has contributed in important ways. And so you can look at Obama's record and whether it's kind of clemency or the speech he gave to the NAACP about ending the school to prison pipeline or his visit to the prison, all of these things have been positive. I have been disappointed in many respects in how he's responded to kind of Black Lives Matter and to Ferguson and the rest. So I can critique the man, but I sort of feel like it's almost besides the point. I think part of our challenge is building a movement and a new moral and political consensus that requires anybody who's in office to embrace certain types of policies, to say certain kinds of things, and we don't yet have that. And so my focus isn't on is he a good or bad guy, is Hillary a good or bad woman, are they good leaders or aren't they good leaders, but what is the nature of the political system that exists today? And today we have a pay-to-play system. We have not a true democracy. We have a faux democracy. We have a democracy that is engineered by corporate media and by a handful of extremely wealthy donors. And it's no surprise that once in office, people like Obama or anyone else rightly feel they have a limited range of movement. If I had been president, I probably would have handled things differently, but I'm really glad I'm not.
Well, I don't know if I'm glad you're not, but we have more elections coming up. We might, convince you. Yeah. I think that I'd like to talk about, what does resistance look like in that pay-to-play context? If we believe that it's going to be populism and a populist democratic-based movement that's going to change things because we can hold the people in power accountable, but our system is one that says you don't have a voice unless you have money, then how does that work? And I want to, there's a follow-up to that, but I guess I'll just stay with that. How does that work in that kind of context?
Well, I wish I had a quick answer to that. You know, I think part of what's really promising about Essie is that what you're talking about doing is harnessing the power of women who are impacted directly by the system, and valuing their voice, their experience, and recognizing that they have power when they choose to stand up, speak out, and organize. There's power in that, and there is. Today, our political system is one where, you know, who gets elected and who has access and influence in the halls of power are those who have money. But to the extent that, you know, we refuse to kind of cooperate with that game and begin to support political parties that are outside of the two-party system and support candidates that, you know, are marching to a different drummer, and begin to build a new consensus about what justice looks like and ought to be, the system has to respond. And I think one of the things that Ferguson and the Black Lives Matter movement has demonstrated is that when we refuse to cooperate with business as usual, the system itself can no longer function well. And, you know, I've talked a lot with Susan Burton about this, and kind of wrote a piece about, you know, what would happen if, you know, people just refuse to plea out. It's a way that we actually do have power there. But, you know, if everyone refused to just stop pleading out, the whole system would crash. It depends on our cooperation. And in so many ways, the system depends on our cooperation. And you know, right now I'm encouraged, for example, by the divestment movement that's occurring in faith communities around prisons, and some, you know, sort of where you say, well, actually, you know, private prisons can be shut down if people won't invest in them, and if it becomes disgusting in people's minds to think about investing in private prisons. If private prisons become, you know, the idea of investing in private prisons is like, you think of that as, you know, as appalling and disgusting as being called a racist. You know, you're profiting off of, you know, people in prison. That is bad. It's immoral. It's wrong. That's shameful. That you would be making money. You would be buying a new house because more and more people are locked in cages. You know, there are ways in which I think we can engage in using our economic power, our refusal to cooperate, and our ability, you know, at the local level and beyond, to, you know, create different kinds of political formations that, you know, have the ability to shake the foundations of the political system as it exists.
Wow. So we got to flip the script. We got to shame them, because they've been shaming us. We got to go shame them. That's what I'm hearing. And I think, you know, there's an interesting question there, and I want to make sure there's enough time for other people to ask questions about what the forms of resistance, who is really putting themselves out. Because when you resist, when you go to trial, it's not, you know, that you put in a lot at stake. A lot. You're putting your liberty at stake. I mean, there's a reason why so many people plea, as you know. Is it fair to ask the very individuals who've already endured and carried and owned so much of this pain to put themselves out there even further and say, hurt more?
No, I wouldn't ask anyone to do that. But I think that, you know, I think that if we're talking seriously about what it will take to transform the system in a meaningful way, it will inevitably mean that some people make huge sacrifices that seem almost unfathomable. And that was true in the civil rights movement. It was true, it's been true through, you can't think of any truly transformative, revolutionary movement that didn't involve extraordinary levels of sacrifice. And that's a reality. And to me, I think that people can kind of get scared off, like, well, I'm not ready to die, so don't sign me up for that. You know, so, and for me, I think of it more as like, not asking yourself, oh, would I have been a freedom rider? Would I have been willing to get on the bus and drive headlong into a county controlled by the Klan? I don't know if I would have been able to do it then or if I would be able to do it today. I don't know. But if I ask myself, can I take one more step? Can I take one more step to being more courageous, to speaking with greater truth and honesty? Can I take one more step towards sacrifice? Can I expose myself to a little bit more risk? The answer is always yes. There's always something you can identify that takes you one more step. And I think that's part of what the movement is about. It's about encouraging people to step out of their comfort zones, to begin speaking truth, which is always scary, and to take one more step in the direction of building a movement that has the potential for being truly transformative. And, you've seen already, on the streets of Baltimore, for example, that there are people already ready to risk their lives for this movement, already ready. And some of us may not be there yet or ever. But if we focus on what's the next thing we can do to be more courageous, to be more truthful in our own lives and our own work, I think we have the ability to do this.
Wow. Okay, I would love to just open it up, if that's okay. And so if anyone has questions for Michelle, I see a few hands. I just want Miss Anita.
Yeah. I wanted to, you were talking about Black Lives Matter, and I was in Ferguson when the police came out.
Yeah.
And we didn't even go there to see the police. We were just there to stand with the family of the murder, the guy, the kid that got murdered, Michael Brown. And when we went there, the police were in front of us, like they were across the street. But what I wanted to ask you about, like you were talking about Black Lives Matter, but these were young people.
Yes.
And I just wanted to ask you, what do you see? Because you were talking about being in Richmond and talking to the young people. And because I'm older. I was there just to observe. I really wasn't there to be shot at or anything like that. What do you see when you're talking to these young people?
I see a whole range, I see, when you talk to a lot of people, you see hurt and rage and pain, you see confusion, and then you also see this incredible brilliance and courage and spark and energy. So it all of it is in there, right? And there's one of the things that I'm most hopeful about is that what is beginning to transpire are these kind of collectives and training sessions and processes where people are beginning to process the experiences that they've had over the last year or two, and begin to connect it to past movements and begin to learn, this isn't new. We're not reinventing the wheel here. There's much to be learned. Our ancestors have gone through various iterations of this. People around, this is connected to what's happening in Palestine. This is connected to what's happening in other places around the world. And as that learning begins and as people begin to share and heal and process the experiences that they've had, I think it creates a foundation from which, even greater movement work can occur. But there's also a danger. I think that people who have been connected to the Black Lives Matter movement have seen that there's a lot of infighting. There's a lot of other stuff going on as well. And so, there's always the risk that some of the, beautiful, brilliant, passionate folks, wind up going in directions that, aren't helpful. But what I see is this incredible awakening of spirit that I think that if we continue to fan those flames, that we can help to support the birth of a movement that's really powerful.
Oh goodness. Okay, I'm Emily. I saw Emily, and then we'll go this way.
I'll stand. Thanks for being here. This was great. I have just a question. Since your book has been out, I think we've had really significant gains on ending the war on drugs. I think there's been really huge victories. Not enough. But I think particularly in California, we've seen some of those victories at the expense of people who are in prison for more serious or
Yes, yes.
And I'm just curious, because I think particularly in thinking about anti-Black racism and the criminalization of people who are in prison for violence, just sort of like what you think of as the next steps that we could be taking as in that next step of visionary thinking about ending mass incarceration around that serious violent thing.
Yes, I think that is the next step, is really talking seriously and thinking seriously about how are we going to begin to build public consensus, a moral consensus in support of, for me, I say is a notion that nobody is disposable, right? That no matter what you've done, no matter if you've killed someone, right? We don't dispose of you, not through capital punishment, not with life without parole, that you're not disposable, that every single human being, no matter who you are, where you've come from, or what you've done, has dignity, has value, and is worthy of some care, compassion, and concern, period. We're not there yet, but I think there is, we have the capacity to help build that consensus, and that means not only kind of telling the stories of people who are, been labeled murderer, rapist, whatever it is, so that they are no longer a label, and that we're able to find ways of understanding and connecting to their basic humanity. And I think part of what's promising about formerly incarcerated, convicted people's work and organizing is that it creates an opportunity for people to see, hear, meet, and appreciate the leadership of people who you would have labeled as, oh, that's a murderer, that's a this, that's a that. Like, oh no, this is a man, this is a woman, this is someone who is a father, a mother, someone who has a perspective that is worth sharing, has a story that helps me to understand how they became who they are. And I certainly, in my own work at the ACLU, was very guilty of telling those stories of the respectable lawyer, doctor, whoever, who is stopped, searched, tossed by the police, and oh, isn't it horrible that this happened to this guy when he just returned from his tour of duty in Iraq? Isn't it horrible that this happened to this wonderful school teacher that was so beloved? And clearly, that is not going to get us where we need to go. We're going to have to lift up those who are considered, beyond our scope of care or concern if we're going to end the system of mass incarceration. So thank you for that.
Other hands. Okay, question right here.
Mine is more of a comment and agreement than a question. The example of our loved ones that are now coming out of solitary confinement because they were willing to put their lives on the line and die of hunger, and have us stand and say, we're the voices of our loved ones that are in there already oppressed, and now they're coming out because they were willing to do it.
Yes.
And we're going to have to do some of that ourselves out here. They were willing to end hostilities amongst themselves and say, we're going to stand together and we're not going to feed into this anymore. We're not going to let them continue to do this to us by pitting us against each other. And we're going to have to do that out here too.
Yes.
And I think that was the same thing you're saying. You're going to have to take that next step.
Yes.
Right.
To even the smallest things, like visiting my son. He was talking about
the massive cost of everything to us when we go and visit. He said, you know, Mom, if we stopped getting quarterly packages, all of us refuse to get them, they're going to have to do something to reduce the cost of things. They're going to have to reduce the cost of these vending machines. Every time you come here, they're 50 cents or $1 more for every item that you could get at the dollar store.
Exactly.
You know, so we are going to have to take those steps, just like you said.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It could start in those small increments, and we've already got the wave going just from those things. Ferguson and our loved ones that are coming out of solitary confinement.
Yes.
The sacrificial forms of resistance you were talking about.
Absolutely.
We have time for one more question, and I think I see hand right there.
My dilemma is, how do you say it? I'm not missing one person. I'm missing my tribe. I'm 50 years old. I'm a former incarcerated woman, so it's like I'm on the 10%. And I went in and out for like years. And I guess I became accustomed to everybody coming up missing. And it's not that I don't want to join the fight or I don't want to go to jail. It's that I'm post-traumatic. There's too many people missing that I can't just concentrate. It's like if I try to go in and think, I don't know how to process. We live in public housing. It's not 1 in 4. It's 4 out of 4. So I'm from public housing. That's where I was like not born, but I spent all my adult years there. So, and I see that we don't really show up to a lot of things. But I just want to speak up on behalf of us because it's too much.
Yes.
It's not one brother. It's all my name. It's not just the incarceration. It's the deaths and the combination of the funerals. And then we have to console our neighbors, and then it's like overwhelming. And it's not because we've been on the front line. So I just want to say on behalf of the people in the practice, it's not that we don't want to participate, it's that it's been going on like for a very long time. And this is very overwhelming for me.
Yes.
You know, the whole thing is like everybody's gone. And I'm not exaggerating.
Yes.
It's like we were a crew of like about 30 youngsters before crack came. And I think it's about 3 or 4 of us in our right mind. Everybody else is like derelicts or homeless or in prison with gang years or dead. And so you have to be able to deal with a lot to come out and protest. And people think that people in the practice are lazy. We're not lazy. We've been holding the pain, the brunt of the pain. So I just want to say that when we don't come out, y'all gotta find a better way to reach us or either figure out ways to process. Because we have normalized, but it's like not normal. And I just want to say on behalf of some people that it's not. First of all, I don't want to go to jail with y'all. I don't want to go to jail with the movement. I don't. I've done enough time. It's not that. I just want to say there has to be an outlet for those of us who've been impacted overwhelmingly.
Yes.
Some of us been holding it like too much of it, and nobody comes to our areas to talk to us. No, I don't live there anymore, but I'm speaking up because I said that's why I got a master's degree. I was going to put myself in rooms where I could speak up for my neighbors.
Yes.
So nobody comes to talk. They feel like we just lazy and we don't come out and we don't want to do it. It's not that. We're the frontline soldiers. We're where everybody gets beat down at, where everybody gets killed at, and we don't have time to come out and put up a sign and deal with that too.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? So
Yes.
I just want to say, I don't know how to process this pain because now that I've been around it, I've always thought about incarceration about myself. So I'm here for me, actually, because I'm still incarcerated. With a master's degree, I'm still on Section 8. The hardest I've ever had to get a job was when I got a master's degree. Okay? So, that's another story. What I'm saying is, I'm overwhelmed. This is overwhelming. I don't know if my mind is like, I'm post-traumatic from prison and the crack epidemic. I would like to leave, but then I'm angry. And I guess I learned how to be angry instead of sad. I don't know. I don't know. Anger hasn't it doesn't feel good. To me, it's too much. And I learned how to move on with my life. by not thinking about all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then so, but then now we mattering, and I'm like, okay, where can I fit in?
Yes.
But I want to know if I sit down and look, I've already done it. I've already, some of us who might can't get up and join don't think that it's because we've already been there doing this for 30 years, taking the abuse. You know, so y'all, since you haven't, maybe you hadn't taken all the abuse, then you got enough strength to walk for it. But we ain't already did.
You know, I so appreciate it. I think I just. You want to speak first?
I guess my question to you, would be, what is the importance of healing in this work?
Well, yeah, I'm just so glad you shared what you did. You know,
Absolutely.
and one of the things that took me back to was when, way back when I was at the ACLU, I participated in a demonstration where we took over the Oakland jail. We did a sit-in at the Oakland jail to protest, what is it, Prop 21 that was gonna, and so we're chanting and carrying on, doing our takeover of the jail, begging to be arrested, you know. And we all get arrested, and we're all of us, you know, a big group of women, we're all in the same cell, you know, eating our bologna sandwiches, and we're singing and we're chanting, and we're just, you know, acting like fools up in there. And while we're doing this, I start to notice that in like a cell close to us, there's a woman wailing. I mean, wailing, soul-wrenching, spirit-murdering, just from the bottom of her soul, just crying. And she's saying, my baby, just over and over, just crying, my baby, crying. And she's screaming and yelling. Here we are. No peace, no justice, no peace, whatever the hell we're saying. And then we all finally like start quieting ourselves down. We're realizing like there's some serious suffering happening, right? And we're chanting and blah, blah, and we're building the movement, whatever. And it was just a moment where we all just fell silent and realized like we're visiting, right? We're visiting right now.
Yeah.
And like what we're experiencing is a field trip, and we're all waiting to get out and say, oh, we went to jail. You know, we got arrested and this and that. And we were just visiting. And I think that what you shared is a reality. There are people who are not trying to sign up to go back, right? And that's real. And I think that there's a way in which we have to respect that. But I think also the piece that you just raised, which is that there is so much trauma that needs to be addressed and healed, and there's not the resources, there's not the support, there's nothing. I mean, when there's a school shooting at one of these white schools, all of a sudden there's like an army of, you know, psychologists and therapists are swarming around, and it's just like, how can we help them deal with this one horrible, frightening, terrible tragedy, and yet people are living tragedies day in and day out. It's become the daily norm, and yet they're just supposed to just like get it together. And why don't you have a job yet? And why can't you stay? You know, they're constantly blamed and shamed for their experience while they're trying to process just extraordinary levels of trauma. And I think one of the things that's really promising about Essie is that there's a vision of creating circles of support in every community for people who are dealing with the trauma of this just survival in this era of mass incarceration. And so, you know, imagining that, you know, one day there could be in every town, every city, every neighborhood, you know, a circle of support where you can go and show up, just like if, you know, where you have a place to go, where you're going to be held in love, you're going to be held in understanding, and you have a place of processing and sharing and getting support to deal with the trauma. And we can't expect people to be able to just join the movement, you know, if they're struggling just to deal with basic survival related trauma. And so I feel like that's one of the great gifts that Essie is, offering at this time, and so I hope we can support that dream as it comes to fruition.
Thank you. And I am so grateful. Thank you so much. So, the night's not over because we party a little bit at Essie. And we know how to throw a party. We got some chicken and waffles and all these things waiting for you. Are you about to, did I pull your punches? Okay, sorry, I was so excited about the chicken and waffles I didn't announce. But speaking of gifts, can I just really do the thank yous and then the thing?
Don't leave.
Okay. So we have a gift for you. This is a lot of different things.
Thank you.
But it was just such a pleasure. This was so fun for me and so special. And I think everyone really felt your energy and is motivated and inspired by your passion. And I think we will all commit to go one step further than we already have. So thank you for that. I would like to just thank, there's a couple of people and folks who made this possible. This didn't just happen just by a wave of a wand. And so I would be remiss to say, I know it was nothing. Essie is a staff of 2 people. And so it is with the help of a tremendous amount of volunteers, of Essie sisters, of community that we make things like this happen. And so I want to just acknowledge some of the people who are also part of our community, which is our funder community. And we are so pleased that the Ms. Foundation and Teresa Younger, where is Teresa? Teresa has just, and not just with kind of as a black woman that is in charge of this feminist space and this organization. I mean, this is a model and an inspiration and has been more than just support with dollars, but support with thought leadership, and I thank you for that. Zellerbach Family Foundation is Amy Price here. Thank you so much. She came to the call. We sent an email. She came through. Pillsbury is Brian Wong here. Thank you so much, Pillsbury, for all you've done for us and for Essie. The Race, Gender, and Human Rights Circle of the Women's Foundation of California, NUJA. Thank you. And the California Bar Foundation. Is Sheila here? I think she's. Thank you for being here, and thank you for making this happen. I also just want to thank the Fund for Nonviolent. Well, right, we have many of other funders who come through for us. The Akinati Foundation, Echoing Green, Google, Chelsea's here. Echoing Green, I want to just acknowledge Cheryl Dorsey, who's in the house, who is, again, another one of those role models for me and has been a funder and a seed funder for this work. The Isaac Simons Foundation, the JMK Innovation Prize, the Women's Foundation of California. Oh my goodness, what would we do without them? The Fund for Nonviolence, one of our earliest supporters, Monica and Betsy. I just don't know what we would do without you. You were here last year, and now look at all these people. Spark, is Jackie here? Jackie's coming later. Spark has been awesome, and Open Society Foundation, the Harvard Public Service Venture Fund, and I have done my thank yous in terms of the funders. But I would also like to thank Dana Underwood, who's here, who's a fantastic photographer, who has donated all of these Stand With Her photos, and he is here. Thank you, Dana. And I'm sure I'm leaving out so many people, but we gotta eat and have some chicken and waffles. So we'll do our thank yous outside. Is there anything that you would like to?
No, I just think this has been extraordinary. I think we should all applaud both of our wonderful. So here's what's going to happen. There's chicken and waffles and baby burritos next door. So eat. Shuttles. There are shuttles leaving for the hotel at 8:30 and then again at 9:30. So eat, talk amongst yourselves, talk amongst everybody else.
All right.